Thank you very much. It's great to be here in New Zealand. In fact, it's rather incredible. This is a kind of a dream come true for me. I have never been to Australia nor New Zealand, and we're going to have the unbelievably fortunate opportunity to travel throughout the South Island as well as see some of the sites here in the North Island. I understand it's the most beautiful place in the world, and you're very fortunate to be right here. Some of you may not be aware that how fortunate you are. That happens to me too. I live in San Francisco, and I don't give a hoot about cable cars and all of that, and Golden Gate bridges. I grew up there after all. Well, it's an honor, a deep honor to be here tonight. Let's get started. So, just as architecture and engineering projects have been sometimes extremely difficult, sometimes quite joyful, this particular one has proven to be one of the most difficult. And not difficult in terms of reaching conclusions, though, but difficult in terms of the implications of those conclusions. And also quite difficult in terms of finding people who are open-minded and willing enough to examine the facts about the destruction of these high-rises that we're going to be talking about today. So we have an unbelievable opportunity here, and my commitment to you is to speak the truth and to leave you with extremely valuable information that you can use to enlighten yourselves, your friends, and your colleagues. But please, don't believe me. Check out every fact that you hear, because it's extremely important that we understand the whole truth about 9/11. After all, it served as the pretext for the invasion of two countries in which already over 1 million people have perished. Also for the loss of many of our cherished freedoms through legislation in the United States, such as the Military Commissions Act, the Patriot Act. I understand there's some legislation that you've been fighting off to stave off attacks on your own freedoms as well as a host of other ills, of course, that we're suffering from as a nation. Now, all of this remains intact if we ignore the truth about 9/11. And only the truth about 9/11 can stop another 9/11 type attack from happening again. So these are among the many reasons that we must find out exactly what happened and why, and to bring those actually responsible to justice, and re-examine the relatively new physical evidence that we've not seen in the mainstream media. But first, I'm an architect, about 20 years, San Francisco Bay Area. I've worked on numerous fireproof steel frame buildings, including these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, and this $120 million high school as well. Also, this $400 million project in Nevada with over 1,200 tons of fireproof steel frame framing. So this is mid-rise office space, parking structure, and so forth that I helped to co-manage. Well, do Americans really want a new investigation? Well, Time magazine reports that about 36% of them do. They say it's a mainstream political phenomena. So this is extremely important. I mean, we're not alone here questioning. But this other poll, in 2007, finds from Scripps Howard Ohio University, finds that 16% of Americans believe that the World Trade Center Twin Towers were brought down by explosives. Well, NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology we have in the United States, says they found no evidence for explosives in the World Trade Center towers. Later, they acknowledged that they never looked for it. How can you find what you're not looking for? They refuse to look for it. They acknowledge that they refuse to look for it. I think you'll be surprised by that. Well, 9/11, just the sound of it brings many of us, this date, back to the terror-filled morning where we experienced shock and awe, really, as we were hit by these repeated attacks. And what happened? We were placed in a state of a trance, really, a cognitive dissonance. And then in this state of mind that probably most of the world was in, we were given the facts, so-called, the theory, really, about how the towers came down, and of course, who caused it. So maybe we've had enough time since to step back and lift ourselves out of this trance after 8 years, and also to look at new evidence that we've not seen in the mainstream media. And so let's today commit ourselves to examining more objectively the facts of the matter. Let's start by getting on the same page and seeing what happened that morning that we all agree on, and then how this myth of 9/11 developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So what was the gas he emitted?
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
I'm hearing some chuckling, and for those of you who might not have a clue as to why, as I did when I first saw this, here's a gentleman right off the street, the first one interviewed by the major mainstream media. Doesn't appear to be in a state of shock like everybody else. Speaking objectively, I witnessed. Who's talking like this? Everybody else is running around in a state of shock, and he has the answer, the official answer that fire protection engineers, structural engineers have been arguing about for years since. Right off the street, the first one. Where did he get this information?
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, this is Gene Corley, American Society of Civil Engineers. Where did he get this? He got it from this guy on the street who had it the first day. Well, fortunately, we have a method in Western science given to us 100 years ago or so that helps us to winnow truth from error. So we're going to try to apply that tonight. We start with a question. How did the Twin Towers come down? That's fair. This is called the scientific method. And we perform research and make observations, gathering data. That's the first step. Then we construct a hypothesis and make a guess, our best guess as to what happened. They came down by fire. They came down by controlled demolition. We make predictions based on that hypothesis, and we test that hypothesis with experiments, verifiable, repeatable experiments. We analyze the results of these experiments, and if our hypothesis is corroborated by the evidence, the research, the experiments, we report it in a fairly open, transparent manner. So others can build on the body of research and work that we've done. This turns a hypothesis into an established theory, and it works forward from there. Now, if the hypothesis is not corroborated, what we do is we go back and construct a new hypothesis. So we'll see how NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the U.S., did relative to the scientific method, and apply it also to the controlled demolition hypothesis, which, as I suggested to you, was not looked at all in the official reports. In fact, they refused to. So let's start by gathering some data. Fortunately, we have very different and identifiable characteristics of the forces that destroy buildings. Let's take a look at a few of these. Fires, for instance, destroy buildings very differently than controlled demolition. It's an organic process. It moves through a building every 20 minutes or so, burning out one area and looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a building does collapse due to fire, it will start with large gradual deformations. It'll fall toward the path of least resistance. It'll fall over. And this, by the way, never happens in steel frame buildings, as you'll see, even though we have over 100 examples of very hot, large, and long-lasting high-rise fires. Let's see what's supposed to happen in a steel frame building.
In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, meaning 9/11, when we had the first 3 do exactly that. So I'd like to ask you to log this information we're looking at relative to fires, what they do and don't do to steel buildings, and what earthquakes do, and in this case, where we have buildings that fall over in a natural process, an organic process. There are structural elements are tied together. They don't dismember from each other, and we don't have pulverized concrete. We see what's pretty much a building at the bottom of the pile, mangled certainly. Compare this then to the Twin Towers and the third building we're going to be looking at today. These buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing and enormous clouds of pyroclastic-like dust and smoke with pulverized concrete in the air, expanding gases forming this cauliflower-like formation from the incredible heat of the explosives. And we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. So if we have these characteristics, we know we have explosions. We'll be looking for those elements in the Twin Towers and the third building. Now, this is a typical classic controlled demolition. Fortunately, we have hundreds from across the country from which to make our comparison, because it's the most commonly used method of bringing down high-rises. So this is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. They can be engineered in many different ways. Normally, the purpose of a controlled demolition is to remove a structure and avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and to do so economically. So typically, a tall building like this is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building, and then detonating them in a very precise order, starting with the interior structures and progressing outward, and synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the interior columns allows the unsupported weight of the building to be harnessed to do most of the destruction. So the result is an implosion, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse like you see here, at virtually free-fall acceleration. It's going down as fast almost as you can drop a brick off the top of the building, and to a consolidated rubble pile that's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. So this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish. And fire never has. So let's take a look at some of these typical characteristics. First, we have a sudden onset of the destruction of the building, starting at the base of the structure in a typical controlled demolition. We have straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint because demolition waves remove that column support, resulting in a free fall, acceleration almost, through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel supporting that building. We have a total dismemberment of the steel structure, so it's broken up and ready to be loaded and shipped. We have minimal damage to adjacent structures. We have sounds and flashes, heard and seen by witnesses. Enormous clouds of pulverized concrete, and sometimes what appear to be squibs or high-speed isolated jets of dust, pulverized building materials that go off possibly at the wrong time. And of course we have chemical evidence of cutter charges found at the base of the building in the rubble afterwards. This all constitutes direct evidence of explosive destruction. If we have any one of them, we know we had an explosive destruction. If we have all of them, we can be darn sure. And now, interesting thing is, none of these can be characterized or created by fire, ever, let alone all 10 of them. Especially if you have additional corroborating testimony from witnesses, government documentation, foreknowledge, because these are planned months in advance, of course, and video documentation. This is all proof beyond a reasonable doubt of controlled demolition. Well, let's just apply that background research that we've done here today, more so than NIST, FEMA, or the 9/11 Commission report ever did, by the way, which would have been really helpful. Let's apply it to Building 7. Now, how many of you have never heard, like I hadn't 3 years ago, of Building 7? Could you raise your hand really high? Well, this building was 47 stories high. It was eclipsed by the Twin Towers. That's the only reason we see it being dwarfed. And it wasn't hit by an airplane. It's about a football field in length away from the North Tower. And at about 5:20 in the afternoon, it goes down. It sustained a little bit of damage from some of these beams and columns that were flung at huge distances, as we'll talk about, from the Twin Tower, the North Tower. But it remained standing, and there wasn't fires visible until after noon or 1 o'clock or so. We'll show you those fires. But what we want to do is take a look and see if Building 7 has any of those key characteristics of controlled demolition, so we can compare it. Do we have a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the building? Well, let's listen to this medical student, Daryl, interviewed that evening on New York radio.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. Then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
A shock wave ripping through the building, windows busting out, a sound of a clap of thunder, and then the building coming down. This is a series of events that we'll see again and again in many of these quotes. A sequence that is clearly points out that we have the phenomena and then the buildings coming down. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's own footprint? Let's listen to Dan Rather narrate for us Building 7's destruction.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
So here's Dan using his intuition to try to make sense out of what he's seeing. We all might do and should do the same thing. This is extremely important. Now, he never repeated these words after 9/11, nor did we see Building 7 coming down after 9/11. Now, this is the third worst structural failure in modern history. It should be of great import to everyone. But most every architect and engineer in the country knows nothing about it. That is incredible. And the media has a lot to do with it. They just won't play it. Let's see, take another look from West Street. Smooth, straight down, symmetrical.
It's gone, man. 17 down.
Once more. Let's bring it back up. Take one more look. See, the penthouse comes down a second prior to the rest of the building. And in fact, about 6 seconds prior to that, we have the east penthouse coming down, which occurs which is right above column 79, which is why the official story focuses right there on column 79. What do they say about column 79? They say that we have, for the first time in high-rise history, a building coming down due to normal office fires, by the way. No contribution from diesel fuel, because there was diesel fuel, and at first there were some stories about diesel fuel and ravaging the building. But they say, no, that didn't happen, actually. In the final report, which just came out about a year ago, and so they pull the rug out from underneath the debunkers who were talking about all this diesel fuel. They also pull out the rug from the debunkers who are saying, well, it was hit by all this debris from the North Tower, and that's what caused its destruction. No, the debris from the North Tower was not a significant factor, according to the official story. What happened, they say, was the expansion of these 50-foot long beams, pushing this girder off of its seat on column 79. And then what happens, they say, is the floor, therefore, crashed down and knocked this floor down, and we have the subsequent collapse, pancaking collapse, classic progressive collapse, they call it. How can it be classic if it's never happened before in history? But that's another point. And then we have the lateral transmission of this instability through the building and the vertical transmission of this through the building in just seconds. And then the whole thing comes down in 6.5 seconds. It's really quite unbelievable. Here are the fires attributed to that collapse. There's 8 to 10 small fires. Here's 2 of them. The other ones are smaller. These are the worst examples of fires that we have photographic or video evidence of. There's no raging fire. There's a lot of smoke on the other side. We'll take a look at that. But this is 2:30 in the afternoon. This is 3 in the afternoon. By 4:45 in the afternoon, those fires on this floor, the 12th floor, where they say the initiation of this collapse begins, they're out. They're out 45 minutes prior to the collapse of this building. How can it have gotten so hot in there when the fires are already out? Steel regains much of its strength after the fire passes through. It doesn't continue to weaken. So this is extremely important. By the way, the 12th floor here is the floor that's operated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is a fact, not a conspiracy. But they lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases that they were actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. So we would certainly like a thorough investigation into the fires that started, curiously enough, on this floor. But let's take a look at NIST's proof that their theory stands. Here is their computer model that they spent years and years on. What's happening in this computer model? Well, first we'll see that it's almost like a sand castle being sprayed with water. We have 400 structural steel connections failing per second in what's supposed to be a gravitational collapse. That's quite fascinating. Structural steel doesn't work like that for those of you who have worked with it at all. What else do we see? We see the top enfolding itself as if it is about to tip over. It behaves nothing like the actual video documentation that we just saw, the smooth, straight down symmetrical collapse. In other words, they can't even get their computer model to reflect what's happening in the videos of what actually happened. And then what else do we see? This is a slowed down version, by the way. The whole thing happens in 6.5 seconds. So after about 3-4 seconds, they stop it. Why? Well, the whole thing looks like it would have been tipped over and looked nothing at all. Were it to finish, it would be tipping over. So there's several problems within NIST's best proof of their collapse due to progressive fire. In fact, look at the models below. The massive indentation and bulging in this perimeter steel frame system. This is where the columns and the beams are extremely rigidly welded together around the exterior of this building. And so any deformation and any internal failure would clearly cause this kind of deformation. But we don't see that in any of the videos actually what happened. Hey, let's take a look at Building 7 on the left, side by side to a known controlled demolition, and see if there's any relationship. Is there enough relationship to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Perhaps the first hypothesis that should be investigated, especially given all the witness testimony that you're going to hear about explosions. Now, how do we bring a building smoothly, symmetrically, straight down into its own footprint? These are the core columns. They have to be removed instantly, within a fraction of a second of each other, on each floor, timed in sequence, in order for this building to fall straight down. Any deviation from this pattern, and we have the building tipping over. And there are plenty of examples of controlled demolitions that go wrong, and they do end up tipping over. So NIST acknowledges, in fact, that this building went down quite fast. We'll take a look at that right now. We have a feather and a hammer. We're going to drop them at the same time on the moon. Let's take a look.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the two of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that?
Well, this is pretty interesting. What's relevant about that? The feather here on this planet, because of air, has resistance. The air is what keeps it from falling as fast as the hammer. So we go to the moon and we remove that resistance. There's no air on the moon. So when the feather falls, it falls just as fast as the hammer. What are we doing in the building in order to remove the resistance so that the building can fall as fast as the hammer? We're removing the columns, and this can only be done explosively, as we'll see. You can see the building gaining downward momentum second by second. We can lay the data on a graph of drop distance versus time, and it fits the free fall curve almost exactly. Let's take a look at physicist David Chandler.
You can measure the downward acceleration of Building 7 by video frame analysis. I used a magnifying glass to place markers on the corner of the building on each frame. From this we can get a data table and various graphs. The slope of this graph indicates acceleration, which is shown here to be about minus 10.279 plus or minus 0.6. Free fall in a vacuum is minus 9.8 in these units. That falls within the margin of error of this measurement. In other words, the rate of fall of Building 7 in the first few seconds is indistinguishable from free fall in a vacuum.
This high school physics teacher forced NIST to acknowledge publicly that, oh yeah, you're right, the building came down at free fall for the first 100 feet. That's 8 stories, free fall. And that's just in 6.5 seconds. Your tallest building is the Majestic building here in Wellington. It's 24 stories. This building's twice that. So what I want you to do sometime, the next time you see that building, is count as fast as you can the stories. And by the time you count to 24 stories, this 47-story building will have fallen 4 times. That's how fast it's coming down. And NIST acknowledges this only upon being cornered by members of the 9/11 Truth Movement. Before they were saying, oh no, if it came down in free fall, that would have meant that there'd be no structure. So they acknowledge finally that there's free fall, but they do not acknowledge the implications of that free fall. We have the total dismemberment of the steel structure. This was a 47-story skyscraper that collapses into a pile about 4 or 5 stories high like a house of cards. In order to do that, because of its moment steel resisting frame, we have to cut all those connections to get it to fall like a house of cards. That fast and in that small of a pile. Remember, buildings that fall due to natural processes, the structural steel hangs together. It doesn't dismember itself. Do we have sounds of explosions, though? Here's this whistleblower, Craig Bartmer, from the New York Police Department.
And the whole time you hear him thum, 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 thum. So, I think I know an explosion when I hear it, you know? I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down, and I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did, and a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
Well, here's another guy, Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, first responder, talking about his experiences out there prior to Building 7.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Goodness, that's very helpful testimony. How many of these witnesses hearing explosions ended up in the official reports? 9/11 Commission report, FEMA report, NIST report? 0. Why? Maybe we can take a guess later. These explosions were like this.
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Now that's an explosion. Most of us would agree. Not a floor falling onto another floor. But it's certainly an explosion that didn't make it into the official report. Now, do we have pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete? Watch this material racing down the street in every direction away from Building 7 immediately following its collapse at 35 miles per hour, 50 kilometers per hour, fueled by this intense heat propelling these cauliflower-like formation. Where does all that heat come from? It's not coming from those 8 to 10 small fires that we just saw. We'll take a look at where it might be coming from right now. Because they found pools of molten iron. What the heck is this? Well, this section applies to the Twin Towers as well. So let's broaden our perspective now off of Building 7 onto the Twin Towers as we see pouring out of the South Tower at the 78th floor, 10 minutes prior to its collapse, this molten material. NIST says this must be melted airplane. Now, melted airplane looks like molten aluminum, which is not glowing bright orange, yellow in daylight conditions at all. It's very silvery in color, so it's not that. Strike one against the molten aluminum theory. Who says this? As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning. Molten steel was still running. It is a quote attributed to Leslie Robertson, the World Trade Center structural engineer himself, speaking to a group of structural engineers. Is he a credible witness? Is his associate, Richard Garlock, who says the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. And this urban search and rescue worker, molten metal flowed in the pile of ruins, still settling. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. And the first responders and demolition contractors, what do they say? This is Peter Tully, hired to clean up the mess after the disaster. Saw pools of literally molten steel, dripping from the molten steel. Steel flowed in molten streams. Seeing the molten steel. Uncovering red-hot metal beams. Molten steel beams. I could go on and on and on, and I will if you let me. But this structural engineer says he documents he saw the melting of girders. Guess what? Fires don't do this to steel. And as you'll see, neither does jet fuel. What else did they find in the ruins, the rubble underneath the towers?
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite. It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat. And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
This is pretty important. They're pulling this stuff up by the tons, and it doesn't rust, so it's not aluminum. Strike two against aluminum. What else did they find? We have pools of very hot substance picked up by the USGS overflights with infrared, finding very, very hot surface temperatures, 600 to 730 degrees centigrade at Building 7 and the North Tower and also the South Tower. This is fascinating because these temperatures are as hot as the very, very hottest office fires. But the problem is that the collapse had already happened. This is a week or so later. What are we measuring if there's no fire on the surface? We're measuring the radiant heat that's coming up from below in the basements, in the bottom of the rubble pile. That's what we're measuring, and surely the source of that those temperatures must be at least twice this hot. Thomas Eiger, supporting the official story, says 650 degrees were the likely temperature of the Twin Towers. NIST claims a little bit hotter than that. Even so, we're talking about structural steel not melting until about 1500 degrees centigrade. More than twice that temperature. Where are we getting the energy, the heat from to melt all this steel? Well, it turns out thermite produces molten iron, as we'll see, at temperatures exceeding 2500 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a likely suspect. We'll see if there's any relevant data to support that hypothesis. But first, let's see what the official story says. Those supporting it, John Gross in this case, lead engineer for NIST, what he says about the molten metal.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah. Like
lava.
Volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult. The steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks at least.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
If the data doesn't support the hypothesis, simply deny that it exists. That's where our tax dollars go in the U.S. I hope yours are better spent. We have chemical evidence of cutter charges. Let's see. What's in this molten iron?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, there's some interesting information about thermite. It produces molten iron as its byproduct. Well, Dr. Stephen Jones, a physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, finds that if there was thermite, you should look for a white-hot yellow reaction zone with white-hot yellow liquid metal pouring off. But also it would leave behind common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, and unusual elements like fluorine and manganese that have absolutely no business being in the residue of an office fire. It's these elements here all together. And Dr. Jones in Utah sent a chunk of this 40-pound piece of previously molten iron, and he does electron microprobe data. What does he find? Well, it's predominantly iron. strike 3 against aluminum from jet planes. Also, he determines that it's not structural steel because it has very little chromium and abundant manganese. This is not melted steel that melted somehow in the hot fires down below, fanned by the subways or something. It's a new element introduced into the building that wasn't there before, molten iron. Iron's not used in structural steel these days, this century. It has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, and potassium. Those are the key chemical ingredients of thermite. It has manganese and fluorine in abundance. Again, no reason for those being in debris. This is clear evidence of aluminothermic reactions. Manganese comes from potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in very special thermite charges called sol gels. They're small particles of aluminum and iron oxide. Can be cast into shape. What you can do is put it in a patented thermite device for cutter charges. And you pack it in here, and in thousandths of a second, it ejects through cutting the steel. It's much more efficient, in fact, than normal cutter charges, which use high energy explosives. My goodness, so that technology is available. What else have they done? Well, in 1984, they have this device here, which is a cutter charge that not only ejects the thermite, but then consumes the casing because it itself is made out of consolidated thermite. The only evidence left behind is liquid molten iron. Fascinating. Let's get a real investigation and find out what's going on here. As was done by the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, which found 1,3-diphenyl propane. Where does that come from? Well, is the signature residue of sol-gel thermite. And EPA finds one molecule present at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've done. In other words, it doesn't come from the plastics in the computers or other high-tech equipment that's fairly normal in offices. Well, is there evidence of thermite actually in the dust? Dr. Jones gets mailed about 4 samples of this World Trade Center dust that I have in my hand right here, and he gets curious. He's looking at it. He said, maybe there's something here. He's a nuclear physicist. But here he goes with his magnet, and he finds granules, like small metal filings that come up. They're shiny. What are metal filings doing in the world? All of the World Trade Center dust samples. More interestingly than that, and we'll make a couple of guesses about that, but we have in all of this dust, which was laid like a blanket, 4 inches thick, 12 inches thick, throughout lower Manhattan, he also finds these small spheres. They come up to the magnet too. That's characteristic, according to the official story, of the World Trade Center dust. Well, if you had thousands of cutter charges laced throughout the columns and beams in the building, thermite cutter charges, whose byproduct is liquid molten iron, and you had under explosive conditions, what you'd have is an atomization of that liquid molten iron. What happens to liquid when it's atomized? It forms itself into what shapes? Spheres, tens of thousands, billions of them. These are the same size spheres that Dr. Jones found in all of the dust. There's no other rational explanation as to how billions of these spheres got in all of that dust. Dr. Jones estimates that it's over 10 tons, extrapolating by how much he found in each of his samples. This is pretty incredible. Well, it gets more incredible. These spheres cool, they fall, and could be the only explanation that I can think of for the corrosion on the tops of these cars, liquid cooling molten iron droplets. Let's take a look at this material in an experiment by Dr. Jones.
Molten iron is sprayed into the air from the thermite reaction. It forms into a sphere roughly due to surface tension, and those solidify in the air. And so all that information is preserved in the dust. And we then look at the dust and are learning a great deal about what happened on it.
He does a controlled experiment on his own, and he collects it and compares the droplets, and sure enough, it's very similar. the constitution of these spheres. The EPA corroborates and finds these spheres also. In fact, R.J. Lee, doing toxicological studies on the building, also corroborates this and says, yeah, these are iron spheres. Dr. Jones concludes that this is significant evidence for aluminothermic reactions. So he goes back to the dust. He finds these chips. This one is about 1 millimeter long. It's one of the bigger ones he finds. They're red on one side, gray on the other, dual layered. He does an XEDS also on this, and compared to traditional thermite, we have some of the same constituents. Well, he puts this chip in a differential scanning calorimeter for all 4 samples and graphs these. As we raise the temperature up to about 430 degrees centigrade, it flashes, it fizzles. It's energetic material. Paint doesn't do this. But not only that, he compares this to published research on nanothermite. And sure enough, it flashes also. That's what it's supposed to do. The interesting thing about this is we blow it up, and we find that the particle size of the aluminum and the iron pieces composing this chip are so small, they're 1,000 times smaller than the human hair. This is nanoscale technology. They're perfectly formulated in the proportion 1/4 to 3/4 aluminum to iron oxide to make thermite. So we know that this this material just didn't happen by falling debris, steel from the towers and mixing with the aluminum cladding somehow, forming nano-energetic composite materials. Doesn't work like that. It's highly engineered material set in a matrix of organic material to kind of hold it all together. Now, this material has been researched by Lawrence Livermore Lab and in the US and Los Alamos Lab prior to 2000. And we have energetic materials that now, as a result of the extremely small size of these particles, have an overwhelming surface area. So the reaction, the chemical reaction, is almost instantaneous, resulting in a fairly explosive result. So we have, for the first time, an incendiary which is behaving as an explosive, but without the large bang associated with high energy explosives like C4 or RDX, without the bright flash associated with those materials too. So if you were going to try to do a deceptive controlled demolition, you wouldn't use those materials. You'd use something else, maybe like this, because that's what appears to have been accomplished here. In fact, it's very well documented at Lawrence Livermore Lab. We have previously prepared pyrotechnic explosive composites based on thermite reactions whose fuel and oxidizer constituents are intimately mixed on the nanometer-sized scale. And guess what? We have the spheres now associated with the partially ignited chips. So we know where the spheres came from, not from cleanup efforts at the site, which is what the debunkers say. The spheres, from welding, cutting torches at the site. No, they're attached to these chips. Many, many examples. Here's just a few. Now, all of this is very keenly documented in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It's available for everybody. It's online. You can get it on our website, ae911truth.org, journalof911studies.com, or go straight to Bentham Open and look for active thermitic material. This is taking scientific circles by storm, highlighting the size of these particles, their mixture, their constituents. It's a real problem for the official story. I mean, a real problem. NIST, even though they've been presented all of this research many times by many, many different people, refuse to look for evidence of explosives. This is compelling evidence that thermite reaction compounds were deliberately placed in both the World Trade Center towers and Building 7. So this is altogether direct evidence of explosive destruction. Remember, if we have any of them, we'll be sure we have explosive destruction. If we have all of them, we can be darn sure. Fire not being able to create any one of them, fire being the official story. In New York, we have a 6-hour fire over 5 floors. It didn't come down. In Los Angeles, 3.5 hours over 5 floors. It didn't come down. Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors that fire burned. Didn't come down. Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. Didn't come down. If any fire at World Trade Center have brought a building down, it would have been this one, I would think, World Trade Center 5, which was thoroughly engulfed with this very, very, very hot fire. Surely it came down as a result of the fires. Nope, they don't come down due to fires. Well, I'm going to suggest that this one might have come down. It's in Beijing in February of this year. Most of us didn't hear about this. It burned over 44 floors, all 44 floors, thoroughly engulfed, and I'm certain that it must have come down. Nope, didn't come down either. I was wrong. See, I can be wrong. This is a natural shape. The building didn't bend due to the fire. It's a very nice piece of architecture, or was a very nice piece of architecture. But this building comes down in just 6.5 seconds after burning for 2, 3, 4 hours with these fairly small isolated pockets of fire, as you see in the evidence, and a lot of smoke, as you need to also note, which some say is coming from the building, others say it's coming from the other building and caught in a negative wind draft here. The FEMA report, they document in their Appendix C some very interesting results in May of 2002 on this steel. We have rapid oxidation, sulfidation, with subsequent intergranular melting. Here's FEMA doing the first serious report on this building, documenting the melting of steel. Remember, office fires, jet fuel don't melt steel. Here, they've documented it. A sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Remember, sulfur added to thermite becomes thermate, reducing the melting temperature of steel. Intergranular melting capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese. Like this former wide flange girder from World Trade Center 7, one of only 2 that was saved. And here they're documenting clearly the melting of steel. What has been done with this Appendix C by NIST when they took over the investigation? Ejected out of the official story. Not relevant anymore, I guess. This is called a cover-up, and there's plenty of examples of it. You've seen many so far. This is just the latest one. Let's take a look at their conclusion. It's even more interesting. The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. It gets even more interesting. Our best hypothesis, fire plus random damage, then complete collapse, has only a low probability of occurrence. My God, what are you supposed to do when your best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence? You go back and you come up with a new hypothesis. That's called the scientific method. Of course, that was not done, and most unfortunate. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, though, for those hoping to resolve the issue, all the steel had been shipped away to China for recycling before the report came out in May of 2002, saying, let's look at the steel and see what happened. Who shipped it to China? FEMA, the author of the report. Most attribute FEMA to this shipment. They're all kind of pointing fingers at each other. Now, this prompts Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cite crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China. These are our fire protection engineers. This is the vehicle they use for communicating with each other in the United States. This is showing astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. Jonathan Barnett, before he joined the FEMA team.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
Why not? Oh, all the steel was removed and taken away to China. Well, what does the mayor of New York say? A former engineering major. Just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. That's in contradiction to what we just heard from official sources even. If the evidence contradicts the fire hypothesis, destroy it. Send it to China. The NFPA 921, our guide for how you investigate, says you should look for conflicts of interest. And you should not have conflicts of interest in your investigation. Do we have any? Well, here's the investigators. Here's the investigations. There's 3 of them. How many of them work for the Defense Department, earning $10 million annually? Quite a few of them. In fact, the leaders of the rest of them. And by the way, these 3 different independent investigations are not independent at all. We have the same characters working through each of them. Who are they? Well, they're SAIC, major defense contractor, and they have been placed in the NIST report by the Bush administration. What else are they experts in? Most of them are experts in thermite nanotechnology. If we put the fox in charge of the henhouse here, Kevin Ryan documents this, the top 10 connections between NIST and nanothermites. It's a fascinating read. This one, a leader of most of them, an expert in the deflagration of energetic materials. Well, what about the experts? What do they say? Here's Danny Jawenko from the Netherlands. He's a 27-year controlled demolition expert. He ought to know. What does he say? It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. Professional work, without a doubt. Why don't we have more controlled demolition experts in the United States talking about this? Their clients are the wealthiest people in the world, as well as the federal government. They're not in a position to say anything, nor was Leslie Robertson, structural engineer for the World Trade Center. They're just not in a position to buck the system that feeds them. So we have to go to unbiased experts. Here's Kamal Obaid, structural engineer, unbiased expert. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Does that sound like something fire is even remotely capable of? And here's Jonathan Barnett. What does he say again?
We were surprised that Tower 7 collapsed.
Do we have foreknowledge of the destruction? Let's listen to these mysterious construction workers and police officer caught on CNN television.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Move it back.
All right, guys? Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
What did he say? The building's about to blow up, flame and debris coming down. And what did that first guy hear and say? Listen to this explosion at the beginning and watch him turn around and address the cameraman about it.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
How do they know? What's going on here? This mystery is getting deeper. And what did Kevin McPadden hear on the radio being held by a Red Cross worker seconds before the building, before he heard those explosions that you heard? They had moved everybody back to this line. And he's standing there listening to this Red Cross worker talking on the radio.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? Why is the BBC announcing the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it happened? She says, Jane Stanley, the 47-story Solomon Brothers close to the World Trade Center has also collapsed. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. Does this make them psychic? What's going on here? Is there a script? This is a valid question. It gets even better. In the good old US of A, we're even more efficient. We announced it at 11:07 that morning.
In New York, Alan Dodd-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Aaron, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down.
15 minutes after the other Twin Towers went down, we have this incredible story about a 50-story building. There was no other 50-story building that went down that day. They could only be talking about World Trade Center 7, which hadn't come down until 5:20 in the afternoon. Had the building come down at 10:45, we would have been completely obscured in the massive dust cloud created by the Twin Towers. So maybe the question is, was it supposed to come down? Is that the reason we have so much foreknowledge? Is that the reason the firemen are scratching their heads wondering why we're not putting out the fires in Building 7 all day? They had been held back. Is that the reason why many people think to this day that they brought Building 7 down on purpose? Because they had heard that. There's just a lot of confusion. They think it's the official story, in other words. The problem is let's take a look at some of the realities here. We have in this building the CIA, the Secret Service, the IRS, Department of Defense, Mayor Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management, a reinforced bunker designed to protect the city in the event of such an attack, which they abandoned, by the way, readily early in the morning. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. Is it likely that Al-Qaeda could have gotten in to plant explosives in the building? Not really. Is it likely that they had access to this very high-tech nano-thermite? Not really. It's not a logical conclusion for most of us. So this is why you hear words like 9/11 was an inside job. It's kind of an inescapable conclusion after you look at some of this evidence. Well, as clear as it was for most of you, this evidence citing the explosive demolition supporting a theory, for 7, the Twin Towers, unfortunately, become far greater for most people in terms of clarity of the evidence. So let's take a look at them. We have the tallest buildings in the world, which Robert Stern says gigantic dumbness, right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world. Others call it the crowning achievement of the international style. You decide, but compare that to the Empire State Building with its kind of elegant unfolding of massing. This was the tallest building in the world up until that time in 1976, when we have 1,368 feet tall with the World Trade Center Twin Towers. 110 stories, each of them. An acre in size. This is a mammoth building, 207 feet square. What they achieved is open office planning. And this was something, as I'll show you in a moment, a massive improvement in high-rise development by consolidating the columns in the elevator core and then having stronger perimeter columns around the outside. We now have 60 foot of open office planning. So the engineering that went into this, the American Society of Civil Engineers calls this the greatest contribution to engineering progress and mankind. That's a pretty lofty goal. In fact, the official story suggests that this building was rugged and robust and not lightly put together or cheap at all. Now, before that, we had a forest of columns every 20 or 30 feet throughout these high-rises, a dense grid of steel or concrete frames throughout the building. But the Twin Towers were built as a tube structure, and this very strong, dense mesh of steel surrounding the exterior, acting really as a bearing wall with punched windows, we call it in architecture. These units were three spandrel panels wide, 3 columns high, and they were welded and then in turn bolted to one another. So this took all the lateral resistance from hurricanes and earthquakes. So prefabricated floor assemblies were then brought in with 4-inch thick concrete over metal decking over these trusses, which were bolted at each end. Now, the official story, as we'll talk about, targets these lighter framed elements spanning 35 feet and 60 feet. That's 20 meters and 10 meters. The result is a structure, a massive structure within the structure. So any collapsing lighter weight truss systems and composite floor decking systems would have left the core structure standing 1,300 feet in the air, as you see in this computer model actually designed to support the official story on our public broadcasting TV called NOVA. It would have left it in the air. So it betrays its original intent here. What we have also is a 100,000-ton heat sink. This will conduct the heat away from the source of the fire, which is the real reason that high-rise fires have never come down in a building, this incredible ability to conduct heat away from the source. What we have is the North Tower hit at 8:46 in the morning. Collapses about an hour and a half later. Then the South Tower is hit 15 minutes later than the North Tower, and it collapses only an hour later, Many people think that the planes hit and the buildings went down. No, it's the fires that the official story faults. Fires that are hot enough to weaken the structural steel and cause a gravitational collapse. I'll give that to the official story. We're not arguing what fires can or can't do to buildings. What we're suggesting is that the evidence of controlled demolition is completely ignored, and so we focus on that. But here's the official story from FEMA's perspective. We have the bending of these floor deckings, and then they pull away from the columns, the perimeter columns, causing a pancaking collapse that kind of zippers around the building and then pancakes down. They threw that theory out because it didn't match the evidence and because it would have faulted the building for the busting of that connection. That would have meant that Larry Silverstein, the owner of the World Trade Center structural complex, would not have been able to collect on his $5.68 billion in insurance payout. So they had to come up with a different theory, and so they did. By the way, Larry Silverstein and company took over the ownership of the World Trade Center just 6 weeks prior to 9/11. That's interesting in and of itself, but not evidence. So the new theory is the column failure theory. It says the perimeter columns failed because the trusses pulled in those columns, blaming the persistence of that connection there. And this is called now the column failure theory that NIST gives us. Either way, it doesn't address all of the evidence that you're about to see, and it's, by the way, generally more difficult for people to understand that the Twin Towers were a controlled demolition because it was so unique, the characteristics of this building's falling, because it didn't really fall. What it's doing is, well, let's take a look. We have a sudden onset of destruction, but not at the base of the building, but up at the point of jet plane impacts. After all, we want to blame the planes and the fires for the cause of destruction, so we're not going to start the explosions at the base. We have the straight down symmetrical progression of collapse, but instead of an implosion like Building 7, everything's blowing outside the footprint. And we have isolated explosive ejections, new information, evidence in the Twin Towers. And we've already discussed the iron microspheres, the molten metal, the evidence of cutter charges, active thermite. Well, let's go on and see, is there a sudden onset of destruction? And what would be producing that? Explosions, sounds and flashes, heard and seen by witnesses. A month after, Thomas von Essen, Chief Fire Commissioner, hires somebody to record 500 of his first responders before their memory became shaped by a collective memory. We have a court-ordered release of this material because the city was withholding it. Mayor Giuliani wouldn't let anybody see any of this testimony. Would it have anything to do with the fact that over 118 of them were reporting sounds of explosions and flashes of light at the onset of destruction? We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember hearing a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially just one flash, then it just kept popping all the way around the building. The building had started to explode. It's like on television when they blow up a building. Seems like it was going all the way around, like a belt, all these explosions. That's when I saw the building coming down. A number of brief light sources, this gentleman saw, being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. I saw low-level flashes. The building was blowing out on all four sides. We actually heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange and then a red flash coming out of the building. Then it would go around the building on both sides. Well, let's take a look at the destruction of World Trade Center 2, see if it bears any resemblance to a known controlled demolition on the left. World Trade Center South Tower, of course, on the right. We'll slow it down. You can start these explosions anywhere you want, in this case, the middle of the building. Is there a relationship? Is there enough relationship to warrant a new investigation into the possible use of explosives? I saw a flash, and then it looked like the building came down. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was. A crackling explosive. Loud boom at the upper floors. And then there was a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. Before it came down, I saw low-level flashes. None of these flashes are a part of the official story. Why not? What did these guys experience?
Floor by floor, instead of popping out. It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom. All the way down.
Well, that's relevant testimony from experts in their field. What do these news reporters and dozens of others say about this?
Anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
And all of a sudden, it was this big explosion.
There was another big explosion. An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. What is going
Oh my God. Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion,
but it was a huge explosion.
Chief Albert Turry told me that he was here after the events that took place this morning. He tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place. And then an hour after, there was another explosion in one of the towers here. So according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
It just went ba-boom. It was like a bomb went off. And it was like holy hell coming down them stairs. And then when we finally got to the bottom, they were coming out on the mezzanine level there, and another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
Like, it sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions, 3 thuds, and turned around to see the building we just got out of. Antenna tip over and fall in on itself.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
Why are none of these witnesses a part of the official story today? Why do we have a developing sequence that is more reminiscent of known explosions, volcanic sea eruption in the Tongan Sea, a known explosion with like geometry of fireworks, a symmetry, pulverized concrete in pyroclastic-like flow? Why does it look more like that than a gravitational collapse? Pretty interesting. And how could somebody have gotten into the Twin Towers to plant explosives? Well, if we enlarge the core area, what we find is that the elevators are immediately adjacent to each of the core columns, 47 of these immense box columns, by the way, solid steel at the bottom, 2 inches thick mid-height, 1/4 inch thick. The lightest part of this building is up at the top. So if you had access, though, to these elevator shafts, you would have unseen access to all the core columns and beams in the building, particularly if you had the excuse of an elevator modernization, which in fact we had going on the 9 months prior to 9/11, where we have 85 ACE elevator employees performing the largest elevator modernization in history. This could have given them access, and we would never know about it because there's work going on in there, and it's documented. So there's no reason to suspect otherwise. Of course, they'd have to have access to through the security company, because we're talking about pallets of high energetic explosives, nano-thermite explosives. So the security company needs to be investigated as well. Securicom, Stratosec. Who sits on the board of directors of those companies? That's an important route of investigation. We don't have to run miles and miles of cable anymore. This is common wireless detonation with remote control by computer. Well, let's take a look at the behavior of the World Trade Center North Tower. Right away, we see explosions going off before a detonation, curiously enough at the top, and here's the point of jet plane impacts, and there's no movement from here down until about 3 seconds after the it begins. In other words, this building is going to telescope from here down to here, and now there's movement down. In other words, half of its volume is gone. Its mass ejected laterally. How is it available to drive the rest of the building down at almost free fall acceleration? It's not. It can't. We have start, stop, belts of explosions beginning already, like the fireman described, all the way around, not only down here, but up here. This section is being destroyed before your eyes. More interesting than this is what's going on underneath the canopy of destruction. Watch the violence going on up here. We'll zoom in that area now. The incredible lateral ejection of this material we'll talk about in just a moment. Take a look right in here. Extreme violence, squibs, etc. 20, 30 stories below what we're told is a pancaking collapse. Look now here, racing down the diagonal corner, almost as fast as this debris is falling down next to it. What's going on? Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse outside the footprint? Well, this is a 200-foot building, almost 70 meters wide, but 1,200 feet, 400 meters wide is the extent of this debris being hurled. In other words, it's an equal distribution debris with this completely broken up structure landing well outside the boundaries of ground zero. Compare that to the nice, neat pile of Building 7 versus the complete equal distribution across the whole site of the debris. Do we have isolated explosive ejections? We call these squibs.
In all the videos of the collapses, explosions can be seen bursting from the building 20 to 30 stories below the demolition wave. Here, 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 and here.
Well, this is pretty interesting. Let's take a look at another set of these squibs. Over and over again, we see these squibs coming out of the south tower, ejecting from multiple floors all at once. This is not reminiscent of a pancaking. We're told these are puffs of air being produced by this pile driver, right? It's driving the rest of the building down like a piston. It's going to push that air down the elevator shafts, and it's got to come out somewhere, right? Well, these are not puffs of air, first of all. They're pulverized building materials. You can see the solids in there quite clearly. And they're being ejected at 160 to 200 feet per second. That's fast. This can only be propelled by explosives. 20, 40, and 60 stories down below. That's how far down they occur. How is that air going to get down there? Well, also, you already saw that section, that pile driver was destroyed in the first 4 seconds, so how could it have pushed any air down anywhere? But let's say that this is the open office planning space that was achieved, right? 60 feet wide, 20 meters. We have over here the elevator shaft, and the air is going to be pushed down by that pile driver. It's going to fill the room fairly uniformly with air, right? And if it busts out any windows, air pressure. If it busts out any windows, it's going to maybe bust all of them or none of them, but not these single point focalized ejections occurring at the violently at the midpoints of the building. This is obviously some kind of engineered phenomena. Let's watch and track a couple of them.
As the south tower begins to explode, we track 2 squibs near the bottom of the frame. They shoot out quickly at first, then slow and merge in with the rest of the dust cloud. Using the first few data points, we see the first squib shoots out at 44.98 meters per second, or about 100 miles per hour. Doing the same for the second squib, we get a speed of 56.3 meters per second, which works out closer to 126 miles per hour.
It's 126 miles per hour. How many kilometers per hour is that? 200 kilometers per hour. Do we have a near freefall speed acceleration of collapse? Let's listen.
Galileo's law of falling bodies calculates the time in which an object will travel a certain distance in complete freefall. Distance, d, equals 16.8 times time in seconds squared. The South Tower was 1,362 feet tall. 1362 equals 16.08 times 84.7, or 9.2 seconds.
Well, here's 2 seconds. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
The Twin Towers came down in nearly free fall speed.
My goodness, let's just try to put this into perspective so we can at least get a grip on it. Let's take a 15-story section of building, this one here, and hold it up by a giant crane over nothing at all, 95 stories high, and next to it another 15-story section, and hold it up the same height over, say, 80,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist that load with a safety factor of 3 or 5. In other words, 3 to 5 times stronger than it needs to be. Now let's let the levers go on these magic cranes. All of a sudden, we're told by NIST, this is the official theory, that they pretty much will hit the ground at the same time. Now, how many of us believe that that is rational, doable, makes sense to you? Anybody? I didn't think so. This is 6th grade physics. We intuit, we know that there's going to be resistance from that 80,000 tons of structural steel designed by structural engineers to resist that load. It's at least going to slow down if it starts at all, right? But no, even if there were no columns in there, just flat floating slabs, if you drop that first section, it's going to take, to overcome the conservation of momentum, the inertia, it's going to even slow down to 20 or 30 seconds, depending on who's calculating this. So this is the problem. But there's a greater problem than this. What is it? There isn't a photo or video that shows any pile driver up there at all crushing anything. In the first 4 seconds, it's destroyed itself. After that, it's the building tearing itself apart, as you saw recently, just now, at free fall, almost free fall acceleration. Turns out to be 2/3 of free fall acceleration. It's accelerating straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. And it's dismembering the structure. Let's take a look at the South Tower and see how it's dismembering. The South Tower is hit 30 stories down, and what happens is this upper mass begins to tilt, which we would expect it to do. But then it completely dismembers itself, disintegrates in this cloud, because we would expect it to fall off the building and then be in some mangled heap at the bottom, right? That's what it's doing. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires, asymmetrical damage from the airplanes impacts. We have asymmetrical damage from this part that's leaning 22 degrees off center. How can it possibly drive the rest of the building down symmetrically? Let's see what's happening from below. Oh, belts of explosions like the fireman described, uniformly wrapping around the building, symmetrically driving down at near free fall acceleration. It makes no sense whatsoever when you start to look at the evidence. It's just getting people here to look at the evidence. I would like every one of you to email Kim Hill at New Zealand Public Radio. And no matter which side of the story here, whether you're unsure, you believe the official story, or you believe in controlled demolition, tell her what you saw here, because she refused to come, because it was inconceivable that this evidence could be true, because she could not conceive of how they could have gotten away with it, how we wouldn't have known by now, how so many people would have had to have been involved, etc., etc., etc. Valid questions that must be answered after the evidence is thoroughly dealt with. Look, we have the boundaries of World Trade Center 1 and 2 And all of the debris is thoroughly broken up and cast outside. In fact, broken into 37.5-foot lengths, these columns ready for shipment. Do we have lateral ejection?
Now let's look at the collapse of the Twin Towers. We are seeing explosions rather than implosions, a first in demolition history. A sequenced rumble becomes a roar as debris is thrown outward. The damage is not contained. Windows are blown from neighborhood buildings. What kind of energy enabled this? Here, a chunk of steel was flung 400 feet, wedging itself deep into 3 World Financial Center on Vesey Street. A FEMA photographer taking pictures of Ground Zero wondered why so many steel beams were jutting from neighborhood buildings. What shot pieces of the towers all the way across the street?
In fact, they went so far, 600 feet away, 200 meters about, and destroying the winter gardens over here. The problem is that these perimeter wall units were 4 tons and 20 tons, depending where they were in the building. They came off of the portion of the building that was the heaviest. These are the mechanical floors and the sky lobbies. Did they need more force to eject those further? Because you would expect the perimeter wall units in a gravitational collapse up at the top to drift the furthest laterally, but no, it's these ones with the mechanical floors. The leading edge of these explosions are perimeter columns, core columns, and aluminum cladding. Let's track one of them.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
Well, what can? Let's take a look and track a couple of them.
Using special software, we can analyze motion on video clips frame by frame. I have placed markers on each frame so we can track a particular projectile. From the markers, we can get a data table and plot various graphs. The data here shows that the object we were tracking was shot horizontally at over 70 miles per hour. The energy needed to hurl a 4-ton girder at this speed is comparable to the energy needed to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles.
That's a lot of energy. Where's that energy coming from? Maybe we can take a look in a moment. Also, I'm looking for about 110 floors at the bottom of each of these towers. This is supposed to be a gravitational collapse. I'm looking for 110 floors, each of which were an acre in size. 220 acres altogether of floors, 4-inch thick, over metal decking, over trusses. Do we have any? This gentleman built those trusses and brought them 30 years ago or more. There were 6,000 of them. Go and identify it. I couldn't believe it. Not one floor panel. Where are they? We have a stack of debris about 2.5 stories. Does anybody see any floors in there? Where are the 110 floors and all of that concrete? In a pancaking collapse, we're looking for pancakes. We don't find it. What do we find? Enormous pyroclastic clouds of concrete. We don't find concrete at the base of the building. We find it in all of this dust. Let's listen to Governor Pataki.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of Lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
And let's listen to Joe Casaligi, firefighter.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
This concrete is pulverized to a fine powder like talcum powder, 90,000 tons of it. Where is the grinder? We might have energy in gravitational potential energy in this building, but without a grinder, we don't get pulverized concrete. What does this gentleman find?
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
There was 10,000 file cabinets. They looked like the one they found, the only one they could find, looks like this. It was found in the basement. 10,000 steel file cabinets. Where are they? What happened to them? And what happened to the people?
Perhaps the most astonishing object Shate found is something there should have been thousands of. This one probably only survived because it was in the basement. It belonged to an ice cream store.
I'd pretty much given up trying to find some sort of intact file cabinet. But while I was at the compound for the Port Authority Police, this ball of metal about the size of a basketball was delivered to them. You can see what remains of the file folders that were inside. These were the day's receipts. These were plans for upcoming birthday parties, flavor mixes for the ice cream.
And what happened to the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Those bone fragments were a centimeter long. There's 700 of them. They're found on the top of this building here. Well, it's not from the jet plane, because the jet plane goes over that building, hits the South Tower, sends its ejections out the other side. Where are they from? This is an incredible degree of body pulverization. We have 2,749 victims altogether, 20,000 pieces of bodies found, 6,000 small enough to fit into a test tube, 1,151 victims, no trace of, vaporized, 200 pieces matched to a single person. Can fire accomplish this? Wouldn't we expect, and gravitational collapse, wouldn't we expect those bodies to be trapped between floors? We've talked about iron-rich microspheres in the dust, chemical evidence of thermite cutter charges. This is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire can't account for any one of them, let alone all of them. We have some interesting feedback about FEMA from Bill Manning, Fire Engineering Magazine. It's a half-baked farce that may already have been commandeered by political forces whose primary interest, to put it mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. The structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. What about that final report from NIST? They're supposed to explain how these towers came down, but they stop at the initiation of collapse. It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Why? Because had they gone any farther than that point, they would have had to account for all of the evidence for explosive controlled demolition, which you've just seen, that starts at about that point. They couldn't possibly have gone any further. Structural engineers do this every day for a living, calculate the ability of a building below to resist any falling mass as a part of it. What was the report called? Final Report on the Collapse of the World Trade Center Twin Towers. They really should have called this Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse. It would have been a whole lot more truthful. There's only one half a page which speculates, after the conditions were reached for collapse initiation, that it simply came down at essentially free fall acceleration because the mass below couldn't resist. That's one half page in the 10,000 page tin rat. They're hoping they'll never read all this. It is a tin rat. Prompting Jim Hoffman to write his 3-year, $20 million cover-up of the crime of the century, in which he documents all of these unfounded assumptions, startling omissions, outrageous lies, fudged computer simulations. It's really quite unbelievable. In fact, their own fire science division chief, Dr. James Quintier, quits, saying, let's look at real alternatives that might have been the cause of the collapse of the Twin Towers. Whistleblowers? Yes. Here's one, Kevin Ryan. Documents that Underwriter Laboratories, our testing agency in the U.S., was hired by NIST to develop this 35-foot-long span designed to mimic what was in the World Trade Center. So they put 2,000-degree fires, that's Fahrenheit, 1,200-degree fires underneath, twice the known amount of loading on top. It didn't fail. It sagged only 3 inches. NIST throws out that data and says, oh, we've got a 42-inch sag. Why would they lie about that? Because they needed that sag to pull in the perimeter columns and justify their column failure theory? What kind of science are they practicing here? If your experiments don't support the fire hypothesis, ignore them and just create your own data. Do we have expert corroboration? Indeed. Many experts talking about sounds of explosions. We have 30 structural engineers with AE 9/11 Truth, multiple fire protection engineers, all of whom are calling for a new investigation. And you can hear and read about all of these on our website. Is this evidence to warrant a new investigation? Let's take a look at this. This challenges our worldview. If this was some sort of an inside operation, we're not equipped, at least in the U.S., I don't know about you here, to deal with the ramifications. This is a psychological operation against the American people, if it's true, designed perhaps to get us into Afghanistan, Iraq. Is Iraq, by the way, based on weapons of mass destruction and ties to Osama bin Laden? You guys know that down here. Even Americans know that much. But an inside job murdering 3,000 of your own people, that's tough to swallow. It challenges us at our core in the U.S., which is why it's taking years to get us past denial and into looking at this evidence. It's not too dissimilar from a massive or very terrible abuse case in a family where for years nobody will talk about it until somebody starts. And what happens when somebody starts blowing the whistle on this? Everybody dumps on them because they're upsetting the balance of the psycho-energy system in the family. This is what happens, and it's not too far off of an analogy. So we come up with excuses right away. Our government wouldn't do this to us. There's too many people involved. All the things you heard Kim Hill talk about. It's natural. I understand that. But it doesn't invalidate the evidence, does it? So what do we have to do? What you don't want to do is go back to sleep, avoid the debate, and become a part of the problem. We need a new investigation. How do we do that? We've got to get motivated and take action based on a rational response to this scientific data. We need to work through our fears, our disbeliefs, and our mindsets and support a new investigation. Get other architects, engineers, and everyone else involved. It's a grassroots movement growing by millions every year. We have to support a new investigation. After all, we're not alone. We have hundreds of 9/11 survivors and family members supporting us. Military, intelligence, law enforcement, government officials, distinguished academic professors, entertainment media professionals, lawyers for 9/11 Truth, firefighters for 9/11 Truth, pilots for 9/11 Truth, including the former defense minister of West Germany, the former president of Italy, the current Japanese high-level elected official, Yukihisa Fujita, and former national defense minister of Canada. Why didn't we hear about this from our media? It might have had something to do with this quote from William Colby, who cites, "The Central Intelligence Agency owns everyone of any significance in the major mainstream media." Google this stuff. It's called Project Operation Mockingbird, designed to put reporters on the CIA payroll. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is facts. It's documented from unclassified documents. Project Censored divulges this information very accurately, citing the 25 most censored stories in America. Why didn't we know the truth about 9/11? Well, it appears as if our government lied to us about the building collapses. The 9/11 Commission reinforced that lie. FEMA and NIST justified it, and the corporate media repeated it, and they hammered it in. We really didn't have much of a chance. So we've seen that Al-Qaeda probably didn't have access to these high-tech explosives or to these buildings. So, and of course, it takes months of planning to place and plant these explosives. So the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth don't speculate as to who might have been responsible, how they got away with it. So unfortunately, this is just the beginning of a very disturbing but essential journey for you and all across the world, really, because we've all been we've all been dragged into these wars and loss of our freedoms. The evidence you've seen tonight is just a small fraction of the vast body of evidence which the 9/11 Truth Movement has assembled for you. So the questions raised are numerous and ominous that must be answered in a real investigation. You'll have to discover that which we have not had time to provide you tonight. So it's absolutely essential that we follow up. And how do we do that? There's books by David Ray Griffin that are excellent. I recommend heartily. The New Pearl Harbor Revisited. Loose Change Final Cut is very helpful in our greater understanding of what happened across the broad spectrum, because the buildings are just one piece of the pie. So we're asking everybody to get involved. In addition to writing an email to Kim Hill at New Zealand Public Radio, tell her your thoughts on this subject. Write your television, radio stations, other radio stations, TV, elected representatives. It's extremely important. Sign our petition. It shows us your support. More importantly, it puts in your own consciousness that you're doing something. You're not just sitting on this information. This has changed the world drastically, and it is the Achilles heel of those who put it together. Become a sustaining member also. If you believe what we're talking about, then you know how important our work is. We have to get to the conferences of architects and engineers. We have to place ads in those publications. We have to be out on the street supporting the kids out on the street on the 11th of every month with our vinyl banners, our DVDs. We're a nonprofit organization. Help us break through mainstream this coming year. After all, we may not have the luxury of time. If they planned and executed one 9/11, then they can plan and execute yet another one. And this is what we'll have more of if we allow the truth about 9/11 to be swept under the rug of history. More false flag attacks against Americans and around the world, more wars with millions more killed, more economic manipulation, worsening financial crisis, more loss of civil liberties, and we become a whole lot less safe, of course. Whereas the truth about 9/11 illuminates the lies and results in the rectification of each of these disasters. So we see 9/11 in a new light as a means of exposing corruption at its heights, and more importantly, as a way of recovering from its ills. So please, it's not too late. Discover for yourself where you draw your line in the sand. Do you just wait for the next 9/11 to happen? Predicted by members of our Congress and our media to be far worse than the last? No. It's time to speak out, because a time comes when our betrayal is silence. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you so much.